and Eve Story by Chan Thomas, Chapter 6, Cataclysms Revisited. The last cataclysm, known as Noah's Flood, is pretty easy to study. It was the start of the new Stone Age, brought about by conditions following the last inundation when even basic requirements for living were no longer available. Since then, uniformitarian geology has been allowed by nature to continue on its path uninterrupted. Thousands of legends arose. 2 cataclysms ago, roughly 10,500 years ago, which we now know to be Adam and Eve's flood, was the start of the Old Stone Age. You can find these 2 last Stone Ages in almost any junior high school general science textbooks. There again, this Stone Age was induced by the total lack of basic requirements for living. It's extremely difficult to find data from the era between the last 2 cataclysms, but it's there. Plus, of course, uniformitarian geology pursued its normal path between cataclysms. Era history is all legendary. 3 cataclysms ago, roughly 18,500 years ago, left little data for us. It is mentioned in Genesis 11:4. Shanidar Cave in Iraq gives us the best data of all. It's discussed in the text of this book on page 98. 4 cataclysms ago, about 29,000 years ago, was the end of the Wisconsin era, and we find more data than we do for the 3rd ago cataclysm. 5 cataclysms ago, 43,800 years ago, was derived by Jess Hale, a superior mathematician. It's a real search. Slowly, painstakingly, we are still putting the pieces of the puzzle together. The more pieces we find which fit into the puzzle, the more pieces are thrown on the table for us, and the more colorful and dramatic the picture becomes. Did you understand that there are 3 cataclysms recorded in the Bible? Noah's, Adam and Eve's, and the one before that. If you missed it, check Genesis 2. I wish we had the funds to dig and search for 3 years in Tiwanaku. A small idea of what could be found in this prehistoric city of South America can be gained by reading 2 books which I have mentioned before but will again, The Calendar of Tiwanaku and The Great Idol of Tiwanaku, both by tremendous researchers Hans Schindler Bellamy and Peter Allen. The conclusions drawn by Bellamy and Allen in these monumental works are startlingly close to mine. The city has lived through at least 3 epochs between cataclysms, the oldest ending about 11,500 years ago, terminating with a cataclysm, the period in its history when it was at sea level, and starting a period of about 5,000 years during which it was at the bottom of the Pacific, then an upheaval during the cataclysm of about 7,000 years ago when it, along with its ocean bed, was raised to its present altitude of 12,500 feet. The cataclysm produced Noah's Flood, gave birth to Niagara Falls, started the Ohio River flowing into the Mississippi, started the Neolithic Stone Age, raised the level of the oceans more than 200 feet all over the world, initiated the era of modern history all over our planet, such as that of Greece, India, Egypt, and gave birth to the Epic of Gilgamesh, containing the story of Noah's flood written by a Sumerian thousands of years before the Hebrews wrote about it in Genesis. Each cataclysm is like a giant hand sweeping across the countryside, leaving its fingerprints for us to find amongst the elephant footprints of science in our search for the solution to this consuming mystery. These fingerprints are well hidden amongst the heavy footprints of uniformitarian evidence. The 2 disciplines, uniformitarian geology and cataclysmology, have no real contest between them. Each has its own place in science, for they complement each other, and actually a marriage of the 2 is in order. Some of the cataclysmic fingerprints have been mentioned in Chapter 2. Let's discuss them in more detail. The story of frozen mammoths is intriguing indeed. No frozen mammoth was ever found in ice. All were found in frozen, homogeneous muck. It used to be that you could buy frozen mammoth steaks in Alaskan restaurants. The meat had been so well preserved by quick freezing in the muck after the mammoths drowning and suffocating to death, then maintaining that frozen status for almost 7,000 years. Perhaps the most noted of the thousands found thusly is Berokhovska mammoth, found near the Berosvka river in northern Siberia. Like all mammoths found wherein some comment was made concerning the skull, it was noted that the skull was pink from hemorrhaging in the head, plus the fact that he had a penile erection, both of these facts giving evidence sufficient to prove that he suffocated to death in the surrounding homogeneous muck. Further, he was frozen so fast and kept frozen for almost 7,000 years, during which his erection was kept on frozen record constantly until he was found. The Baraskra mammoth was found about 1900, and more scientific data was gathered and recorded about this animal than any other such frozen behemoth. It's true that the beast also has initiated more scientific controversy than any other such find. To my way of thinking, one man's work stands far above all others. Ivan T. Sanderson, the biologist, he approached the problem from a frozen foods viewpoint and was the only one to do so. This is his story. When you freeze meat, the problem is to freeze it fast enough that the moisture contained in the meat does not have time to form into large crystals while freezing. The faster the freeze, the smaller the crystals. If you freeze meat too slowly, the moisture will form crystals large enough to destroy the fibrous structure of the meat. When defrosting the meat will be nothing more than a mass of goo, unfit to cook or eat. The larger the piece of meat to be frozen, the more difficult it is to freeze it fast enough to avoid formation of the destructive moisture crystals. For heat must be removed at the same rate from, say, half a steer as from half a pound of ground meat. It would be the same problem if you had to freeze a bucket or a tub of water in the same time it takes to freeze a thimbleful. Now, a mammoth weighs up to 5 tons. Those mammoths found in Siberia were somewhat smaller, but still several ton animals. When the Barasovka mammoth was dissected by Russian scientists in 1901, they recorded that the innermost lining of the beast's stomach had a perfectly preserved fibrous structure, indicating that the body heat had been removed by some process in nature. Sanderson, taking special notice of this one point, took the problem to the American Frozen Foods Institute. What does it take to freeze an entire mammoth so that the moisture content of even the innermost parts of his body, even the inner lining of his stomach, do not have time enough to form crystals large enough to destroy the meat's fibrous structure? The Institute really attacked this problem. To freeze a quarter or half a steer presented a big enough problem, but a whole mammoth? Some weeks later, the Institute went back to Sanderson with the answer: it's utterly impossible. With all of our scientific and engineering knowledge, there is absolutely no known way to remove the body heat from a carcass as big as a mammoth fast enough to freeze it without large moisture crystals forming in the meat. Furthermore, after exhausting the scientific and engineering techniques, they looked to nature and concluded that there was no known process in nature which could accomplish the feat. So many have loosely claimed that the Baraskra mammoth fell in a crevasse or fell in the ice or some such nonsense. There's absolutely, positively, irrevocably no explanation in the known processes of nature to explain the quick freezing of the Baraskra mammoth concurrently with the muck in which he was suffocated and drowned. The Institute did tell Sanderson that it takes what it takes to the job. However, first of all, the body temperature of the mammoth must be lowered about 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 78 degrees Celsius from its normal temperature, and it must be accomplished in an absolute outside time limit of approximately 4 hours. Actually, they concluded the freezing process would have to take place in an elapsed time of closer to 2 hours. The Institute did not take into account the effect on their conclusions, which 2 other factors would have made. First, the fact that the entire strata of muck was frozen concurrently with the mammoth, and second, the fact that his erection had been preserved by quick freezing. The second of these 2 facts reduces our actual freezing time to far below 2 hours. All the 2 or 4 hours represents is the outer limit of time within which the freezing process had to have taken place for no large moisture crystallization to have formed deep in the meat. The second fact tells us that the freezing time, at least for the entire strata of muck and outer parts of the mammoth, had to be less than 1 minute, or perhaps like half a minute. The whole process bespoke of a inhumane, supernatural violence. One foreleg, some ribs, and its pelvis were fractured. Do you realize what it takes to break a mammoth's foreleg and his pelvic bone? He was buried in a sea of muck formed by supersonically moving water, gathering and homogenizing the muck, suffocated and drowned in the muck, and quick frozen in the muck in an utterly impossible sequence of events. But nonetheless, the process was performed, then kept frozen and preserved for almost 7,000 years. Thank goodness for the scientific and intellectual curiosity of the Russian Tsar, who assigned the scientific team the responsibility to form the expedition into the far reaches of eastern Siberia and bring back a thorough scientific analysis of this newfound mammoth near the Berezovskaya River. Today, that same mammoth is mounted in a museum in Moscow. I believe I am correct in stating that it was the first time such a large animal was ever mounted by a taxidermist or a team of taxidermists. Where did the muck come from, which buried the mammoth alive? This frozen mud can be found all over northern Siberia and Alaska. In Alaska, the frozen blankets range from 20 to 90 feet thick, where we have been able to study this frozen tundra more closely. Here in the United States, the evidence shows that the supernatural violence included supersonic winds, volcanic eruption, swift inundation creating the muck, a sudden temperature change too far below sub-zero, freezing, and a precipitous total environment climatic change. The muck comes from the inundation waters moving so swiftly and in such fantastic quantities that the water picks up all kinds of earth, mixes it, homogenizes it with the water, then lays it down in a muck layer. Vivid descriptions of this layer of frozen muck are given by Professor Frank C. Hibben in his book, The Lost Americans. One of the best places to study many layers of muck laid down by many succeeding cataclysms is in the walls of the Grand Canyon or in the Badlands of North Dakota. If you stand in one north rim of the Grand Canyon, pick one strata to follow, and trace it with your eyes as far as you can see in all directions, including the spires jutting upward in the canyon, you will find the strata homogeneous from top to bottom, everywhere as it goes, laid down with uniform thickness, and sharply demarcated from the layers above and below. Furthermore, if you happen to pick a layer that contains gravel, rocks, and boulders interspread through it, you will observe that ossified muck, gravel, rocks, and boulders are distributed throughout the layer quite evenly in all directions. There's absolutely only one way for each layer to have been laid down so evenly and so homogeneously, and that is all at once. All other hypotheses fall into oblivion in the light of the homogeneity factor. This conclusion of the suddenness of the deposit based on the homogeneity factor is strengthened further by the flatness, uniformity, and thickness, the independent character of each layer, and the sharp demarcation between any two adjacent layers. Anyone in the earth-moving business who looks at the strata with the suddenness of deposit of each layer in mind will immediately realize that there is absolutely no way to accomplish this feat throughout any known means of engineering, nor is there any known way in the ordinary process of nature to move that much earth, homogenize it, even with rocks and boulders if necessary, and deposit it all at once over uncountable square miles of surface in one single, flat, homogeneous, even depth layer. The only way possible is for cubic miles upon cubic miles of water to move at speeds into the supersonic range over continents, pick up dirt, rocks, and boulders in unbelievable quantities, mix it with water into a watery mud, have every rock and boulder grind each other into rounded off shapes as if they were pebbles, and finally deposit it all at once over huge areas of land in an even flat layer of homogenized muck, rock, and boulders, which later dries out, and through the ages sometimes ossifies, such as in continents frozen in polar zones. For many years I searched and hunted for evidence of what I call sloshings, or fast-moving muck water as it becomes trapped in a huge basin. In the late 1980s, I found a treasure trove of sloshing evidence in the part of Arizona and Utah known as Monument Valley. Never have I been so impressed with the beauty of nature as I have when first viewing the monument treasures of that valley. It's hard to believe that such beauty can come from the unimaginable violence of a cataclysm pounding on the landscape, which would not exist were it not for the many cataclysms before the last one, each contributing its share toward the structure as we see it today, with thick layers upon layers mixed with thinner layers after thinner ones, each with its own unique color and characteristics with sharp demarcations between all layers. There are also similar layers in Canyon de Chelly, southeast of Monument Valley, a few miles. The thick layers, approximately 60 to 80 feet thick, provide the sloshing evidence. Even though each of these thick layers show definite evidence of having been deposited all at once, each layer with its own color and integral appearance, there was a diagonal sublayer, grain flow, within each layer, tilted about 20 degrees off horizon, with an adjacent sublayer tilted in the opposite direction, both above and below it. These tilted sublayers, in comprising some very thick layers, were stacked upon each other in 15 sublayers, all the same thickness, and each tilted in opposite directions from the layers adjacent to itself. This evidence then finally provided the proof that sloshing does occur in a cataclysm. As the rapidly moving muck water sloshed back and forth across the valley, it deposited a little of itself each slosh. It was moving so fast as to deposit the same amount of itself with each slosh, the total being so homogenized that each sublayer has the same characteristics as each and every one above and below it. Only the grain structure varies in slant with each sublayer. This structure is evident in miles upon miles of surrounding walls of the valley, as well as the monuments therein. Before leaving Monument Valley, I'd like to tell you about one special place in the eastern part of the valley, Mexican Hat. It's a small town sitting next to the San Juan River, with a short plateau on the other side of the river. On the other side of the plateau rises the most unusual mountainside in the world, as many geologists have declared who have come to Mexican Hat from all over the world just to see that mountainside. It rises about 2,000 feet into the sky, with all the grandeur of many sedimentary stratifications, large and small, in evidence. The unique feature of the whole mountainside is that the sedimentary layers all bend over down toward the river as if they were trying to flow into it and disappear. Thousands and thousands of feet of sedimentary strata are bent over toward and into the river in this fashion. This scene is one of the most dramatic I have ever seen, providing the superviolence that occurred during a cataclysm. Proving the superviolence that occurs during a cataclysm. In this case, a huge fissure opened in the earth where the San Juan River flows now, the fissure being open enough to be as a huge jaw opening to its throat, and the molten layer normally 60 miles beneath. Of course, the molten layer would rise into the 60-mile throat, being 60 miles below that of seething white-hot molten everything beneath. The 60-mile thick shell presses down, while also providing a huge fissure for that pressure to push the molten stuff upward into the gaping throat fissure. Now we have the most awesome, horrific, appalling, formidable, terrifying, uncanny, ultimately violent, cataclysmic collision of the forces of nature on the surface of our planet, even beyond imagination, until you see for yourself right at Mexican Hat, with the side of that mountain stopped cold in the midst of its death throes. At this point, the supersonically rampaging oceans and wind hit the scene. So, we have a super earthquake so huge as to open a fissure in the whole shell of the earth, opening a path for the molten layer below to be pressed upward into the fissure, the molten invader melting the hard layer beneath that side of the mountain, the 1,000 mile per hour ocean water slaughtering the mountainside, having lost its foundations, driving it down into the huge fissure and steaming the molten stuff below into solidity, and the mountainside stops feeding itself downward into the maw, while the oceans in their fury pass on, leaving a huge part of themselves sloshing around and back and forth in the valley, plus some surviving beautiful picturesque mountains standing today for us to see. In other parts of the valley, upheavals of sedimentary strata and huge structures point upward, with the rock being scorched in a plethora of places. Church Rock and Aglatha Rain each has many scorched sedimentary boulders scattered around near its base. I've read geologist reports and have been told by Wayne, one of the tour guides at Monument Valley Lodge, one of the nicest places to stay, that he has read geologist reports all telling of lava flows in Monument Valley. I've spent time through several years in Monument Valley searching from one end to the other and even beyond the valley for any evidence of lava. I have never found any evidence anywhere of even a suggestion of lava. All I ever could find was scorched sedimentary rock, which from a distance could have fooled anyone into thinking it was lava rock. I have seen dark scorched rock in abandoned gold mines near Pikes Peak, which scorching occurred during a cataclysm when the heat from the 60-mile molten layer broke through fissures in the 60-mile thick, hard outer shell of the earth, scorching the rocks in that shell. Going back to the oceans of water, mixing with earth and rocks and laying down layers of sloshing sublayers of sediment, a good measure of the speed with which the water must move over the land is provided for us by the granite blocks on the eastern slopes of the Jura Mountains in France. Duluc-sur-Van Buch de Luc Jr. and de Saussure gave us much information through their early geological observations of the dispersion of the alpine granite blocks through the mountains, valleys, and lakes of Italy, Switzerland, and France. Even Becquerel, through his early dissenting observations, lends more credence to the fast-moving water conclusions of the other men because of the looseness of his arguments. The great Swiss geologist Escher gave the most credence to the fast-moving water argument through his observations, which support the earliest concepts set forth by J. André de Luc Jr. in the 1820s. Let us envision the Jura Mountains as if we were looking down from an airplane. First of all, we'd notice that they are similar to the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, for they look like giant wrinkled up carpet with rolling ridges running from northeast to southeast. The Swiss-French border follows the same direction in the middle of the range. You can also see that the ridges have passes through them here and there, so that a person on the ground can see northwest through one ridge to the southeastern slope of the next ridge in many places. It's a well-known fact that the Jura Mountains are granitic. Whatever granite exists in those mountains is still very deep in them. They are largely calcareous. However, in the southeastern slopes of the ridges, there are countless granite blocks sitting on the surface. These blocks, each weighing tons upon tons, have been traced to the Swiss Alps, across the Swiss Valley to the southeast. If you look several ridges to the northwest in the Juras, you will find the granite blocks only on the southeastern slope of the ridge and clustered only opposite passes through the ridge adjacent to the southeast. These blocks sit on the slope at an altitude the same as where they came from in the Alps of Italy and Switzerland, 50 to 80 miles across the valley from Switzerland to where they were deposited in the Juras. In order for them to be found on the southeastern slopes of the Juras, where they are, a tremendous upheaval of granite in the Italian Alps had to occur during some cataclysmic violence, followed by water moving at such fantastic speeds as to sweep up mighty blocks of granite from 50 to 80 miles across Switzerland over the Juras through the passes and deposit them in clusters against the southeastern slopes of the inner ridges of the Juras. It fits perfectly with the picture of supernatural violence uncovered by Professor Frank C. Hibben in his studies of shredded and dismembered prehistoric animals in Alaska, buried and quick frozen in and with muck, together with twisted, torn, burned, and quick frozen trees. Hibben states that one necessary force in the contributing factors is the supersonic winds. The only way of generating such winds over tremendous areas is to move the land in such a way as to depart from its normal west to east daily rotation, so the atmosphere, continuing in its normal daily rotation, will then be moving at supersonic speeds relative to the land over which it is moving. Now, the Earth's normal rotation. The oceans also rotate. Now, in the Earth's normal rotation, the oceans also rotate west to east, 1 revolution per day. When a cataclysm occurs, the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth slips in a direction differing from that of its normal rotation. The atmosphere continues its normal rotational direction, and the oceans also refuse to change their rotational direction. So, the atmosphere and oceans proceed moving over land masses which are passing underneath them in a new direction. Some of the oceans and air moving at supersonic speeds with respect to the land moving in a different direction underneath. With oceans moving over land masses at such speeds, it is easy to understand how the huge, gigantic blocks were moved from the Alps to the Juras while losing little or no altitude, and how cubic miles of earth can be picked up, mixed with water, and homogenized, then laid down in an even, flat, independent layers such as we find exposed in the walls of the Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, and Canyon de Chile. Further, we can understand how the irresistibly overwhelming annihilating force of the waters moving at utterly unbelievable speeds can, in the blink of an eye, obliterate entire civilizations and even every vestige of anything they ever accomplished. Even in our times, there have been occasions when a simple dam's breaking and releasing of waters over a small town below literally wiped out every splinter of evidence of the town and people having been there. One of the fingerprints which the cataclysmic giant hand leaves telling us of this supernatural violence on Earth is the plethora of mammalian teeth of many, many species found in the sharp demarcation boundaries between sedimentary layers such as we see exposed in the Grand Canyon. It bespeaks of animal life being pulverized with teeth, the only mammalian substance hard enough to withstand the onslaught. Some places undergo less violent winds and inundation, to be sure, and there we find traces of prehistoric civilizations which had advanced to achievements we deem impossible for that many years ago. Let's go back to Tiwanaku in South America to see what's there. The Incas discovered this deserted city 12,500 feet above. The Incas discovered this deserted city at 12,500 feet altitude on the shores of Lake Titicaca in the 2nd century AD. Although they lived in that land for generations upon generations, centuries after centuries, they left it totally undisturbed. Anyone who had been on a hunt for gold or treasure in the mountains, as I have been in New Mexico, knows the Indian credo: what is in the mountains belongs to the mountain. That means that whatever they find, they do not disturb nor destroy, nor move nor remove. You can read about it, see it portrayed in movies, or be told about it, but there is nothing like seeing it in person when gold fever takes over an entire personality. It's a kind of consuming greed which changes a veteran outdoorsman to a wild-eyed, scheming, secretive, intense introvert who could lead himself and others to destruction and death through his greed. I've seen it. Tiwanaku was found by Pizarro and had been... Tiwanaku was found by Pizarro and his band of plunderers in the 1520s. The gold fever had evidently taken over his entire expedition of 13 to 16 men, for they proceeded to vandalize almost everything in sight. They smashed thousands of statues searching for gold. There were huge silver bolts of up to several tons each passing through massive stone monoliths. You guessed it, they broke up the monoliths in order to obtain the silver bolts. There was one member of the early discoverers, a Spanish priest, Diego del El Cabaso, who wrote down what he saw. I saw a vast hall carved on its roof. I saw a vast hall carved on its roof to represent thatch. There were the waters of the lake which washed the walls of a splendid court in the city of the dead, and standing in its fine court in the shallows of the water on the platform of a superb colonnade were many fine statues of men and women, so real they were that they seemed to be alive. Some had goblets and upraised drinking cups, others sat or reclined as in life, some walked in the stream flowing by the ancient walls. Women, carved in stone, dandled babies in their laps, or bore them on their backs. In 1,000 natural postures, people stood or reclined. Not one of these statues stands today. The greed of civilization has literally devastated Tiwanaku with vandalism and thievery. However, vandals through the centuries who visited this fabulous storehouse of prehistory did what most do who have treasure fever. They ignored the intellectual values which were less obvious. The great stone gate in the temple of Kalasaya has inscriptions across its arch, and on pillars which, to the untrained eye, appear to be but meaningless picture carvings. It remains for author Ponzansky to realize its importance. He was followed by Wendell Bennett and John Phillips. Then Hans Schlinder Bellamy and Peter Allen completed the picture with their brilliant deciphering and translation of the pictures, so aptly described in their book, The Calendar of Tiwanaku. Their later book, The Great Idol of Tiwanaku, evidences further their brilliance in deciphering and translating the picture symbols carved in the monolithic statue excavated from a buried temple. This book not only explains their deciphering and translation, but tells of the arduous work performed in order to preserve the tremendous monolith. The only thing they don't explain is why this huge statue has 2 left hands and no right hand. The works of Bellamy and Allen show many things concerning the calendar and time standards of Tiwanaku in 2 different epochs, probably the Caspian and Hudson Bay eras. The details and differences between hours, days, and years, then and now, I shall leave to those who wish to read those books. The main point of their discussion, which should be noted here, is that the idol and the calendar both recorded that, during both eras, a retrograde moon satellite orbited around the Earth. During the idol's era, probably 29,000 to 18,500 years ago, the satellite was approximately 24,150 miles from the Earth, and during the calendar gate's era, probably 18,500 to 11,500 years ago, the satellite was approximately 23,360 miles from Earth. Obviously, the moon satellite was far closer to our planet than our present moon. Obviously, it passed the Roche limit of approximately 8,000 miles from the Earth and disintegrated accounting for the many legends of prehistory of terrible impacts with the Earth by asteroids or comets. Where did the moon satellite come from? How did our planet capture it? And of course, where did our present moon satellite come from? When did our planet capture it? And how and why did it happen? If Tiwanaku and its moon satellite are to make any sense for us, these questions must be answered. The Bode-Titus relationship may give us a key to the answer. Titus and Bode, two German astronomers, individually concurrently discovered this relationship in the 18th century. If we take orbit numbers or ring numbers of planets through Saturn, the ring numbers between 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, multiply each number by 3, add 4 to each result, divide by 10, the series becomes 0.4, 0.7, 1.0, 1.6, 2.8, 5.2, and 10.0. These numbers, accepting and skipping 2.8, represent the relative distance of the then known planets from the Sun: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, 2.8, Jupiter, and Saturn, with 2.8 representing no known planet at the time for that distance. When the planet Uranus was discovered in 1781, it fit right into the series at 19.6. The law seemed strengthened, and an intense search was initiated for anything that might be at a distance of 2.1, might be at 2.8 distance. In 1801, the little planetoid Charis was discovered at 2.8. By 1945, more than 1,500 more were found on some orbit. It has been well established as the ring of minor planets or planetoids or asteroids. In 1846, the planet Neptune was discovered, and it seemed to disobey the rules set down by the Bode-Titus relationship. It should have been at 38.8 on the relative distance scale, but it was closer to 29.2. In 1930, the planet Pluto was discovered, and the Bode-Titus law seemed to fall apart completely. Pluto was found close to 38.8, where Neptune was supposed to be, whereas the law seemed to indicate that Pluto should be at 77.2. Since that time, the relationship, commonly known as Bode's law, has been regarded in astronomy as nothing more than an insignificant curiosity. Perhaps a new look at Bode's law is in order. If so much of it is correct, then the part of which appears to be erroneous seems so only because of our lack of understanding of the basics involved. First, instead of using relative numbers, we shall work with ring numbers or orbit numbers. The first progression, 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc., represents these numbers. Also, instead of this progression, which is geometric, except for the 0, let's fill in all of the numbers, making a true arithmetic progression. The numbers will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so on to 256. Now, in this progression, the ring numbers 0, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and 256 can be regarded as mathematical rings. All the other rings can be regarded as harmonic rings between any two fundamentals. The ring which lies halfway between is the first harmonic. Any ring which lies halfway between a fundamental and a first harmonic is a second harmonic. Any ring halfway between a second harmonic and a first harmonic, or halfway between a second harmonic and a fundamental, is a third harmonic, and so on. The next step is to label the ring numbers with the planets as they are actually positioned in the solar system. We can simplify the table if we take all of the ring numbers up to 8, then only the fundamentals, first and second harmonics beyond that to Uranus, then the fundamentals, first, second, third harmonics to ring 256. The first thing we notice is that all of the planets are on fundamentals except Neptune. It's the only planet which is on a harmonic ring, as it appears on the first harmonic 96 between Uranus and Pluto, which are fundamentals 64 and 128 respectively. Now we come to another curiosity. I'm sorry. Now we come to another discovery. The number of rings between the planets increases the further away from the sun the planets are, until it appears that the maximum number of rings possible between planets is 31. On each 32nd ring, there has to be a planet, whether the ring is fundamental or harmonic. That's why Neptune is on the 96th ring, a first harmonic, the 32nd ring after Uranus, with Pluto on the 128th ring, a fundamental, the 32nd ring after Neptune. Something else appears apparent also. When the solar system was born, planets tried to be born on each ring. Full-blown planets were born on every fundamental and on any ring 31 rings away from any harmonic ring. 31 rings away from any other planet. On all other rings, minor planets were born, or a rising of planetoids. Since there are 4 major planets inside the ring of planetoids on 8, let's assume that the entire solar system is made up of 3 groups of 4 major planets plus a ring of planetoids in each group. This means that there may be 2 more undiscovered planetoid rings, 112 and 240. If we look at the minor planets' rings on either side of Jupiter and apply Kepler's laws to them, we find that the moons of Jupiter, even the retrograde ones, are explained as captured minor planets from both inside and outside harmonic rings around Jupiter. Before we examine the results of our construction, let's look into the outer rings of the solar system. Ring 256 is where the comets turn around and head back into the heart of the system. Further, it is known that there is more than one planet outside Pluto. Our table tells us that there should be 3 planets or rings, 160, 192, and 224. The total number of rings tells us that there is a fantastic number of captured and uncaptured minor planets yet to be discovered, the junk of the solar system. Let's look at the abbreviated table of the solar system. The first orderly interpretation of Bode's law, ring 256 appears to be where the sun's belt of protons is. The belt exists since the sun's magnetic field is bipolar. Furthermore, it has to be outside of the planets. It is apparent that our present moon was created on ring 3, Phoebus on 5, and Deimos on 6. Ring 7 is vacant. That presents a real challenge. Whatever happened to the minor planet from ring 7? Okay, there's a chart on page 91 of the PDF. Take a look at it. I'm taking a break. There'll be a part 2 shortly.